turn this over now to Deborah Ayers, who will introduce our speaker. I'm really looking forward to this talk, so I will be quiet now. Deborah, are you there?
I am here, but my internet is going in and
here. Okay, so do you want to go ahead and introduce Kit?
Okay.
Okay, Kit, I don't know all the really good details, and you can add some in, but I've really enjoyed my association with Kit over the last several years. She's a master gardener. She's a landscape architect.
Listen,
She's absolutely passionate. She's absolutely passionate about native plants and their benefit to our ecosystem and the ways that we can help it. And she's extremely knowledgeable. I think I will turn it over then to Kit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I am going to go to share my screen and get us on track. And try to move this out of my way. Okay, and here we go. So I loved it as one of the slides came up this evening from CNPS. And the reason why we're here, when we save plants, we save everything else. And so that's why I'm going to be doing this presentation on homegrown habitat, on how to preserve and restore habitat 1 yard at a time. It's something that we as individuals can do. Ever since the onslaught of European settlement, everything has changed. The whole settlement has changed the face of California, and very little habitat remains unaltered in California. Land conversion is impacting native species at the rate of 1 football field every 2.5 minutes. And let's see if I can get get my slides to change here. It'll probably like jump 5 slides at one time. Let's see. Anyway, so land conversion has been occurring at a tremendous rate. When you consider 1 football field every 2.5 minutes in this state, we're not going to be left with much. And native plants, as we all know, are the cornerstone of biological diversity on which our native animals depend. The ecological Armageddon that has been being brought on by development, habitat fragmentation, is going to be irreversible if we don't foster a new relationship with nature. Living a part of it as a part of it, not apart from it. And so our efforts as individuals will determine whether we can make this happen or not. By restoring nature to our own gardens, corporate landscapes, and municipal spaces like parks, we can provide connectivity through which animals can move and be sustained and still reproduce. We're gonna learn why and how to go about selecting the right native plants for either your existing landscape or a new landscape if that's what you're going to be starting. But we can bring about this change 1 garden at a time. There we go. So California is exceptionally unique in terms of its abundance of everything natural. The California Floristic Province is one of only 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world, and one of only 5 areas in the world with a Mediterranean type climate that we have, which includes our nice hot dry summers and our cool wet winters, and yay, they're here. So that makes us very unique. Also, California is divided up pretty much, or has been, you can clearly distinct bioregions, 10 distinct bioregions. And the wildlife species are just extremely diverse. Roughly 30,000 species of insects. You can see the freshwater fish, amphibians, reptiles, enormous population of, or diversity in birds with over 500 species, 190 mammals, and over 8,000 plants. Wants to work sometimes and sometimes not. There we go. Okay. And of the species of vascular plants in this hotspot, 61% aren't found anywhere else. So it just shows you just how special California is. We have over 52 genera of plants, genuses, which are relates to the genuses, which are endemic and found nowhere else, and over 2,100 species of plants in that. In an article written by Chris Clark in 2016, he's the one who brought up the fact that how fast we're losing habitat. And this is between 2001 and 2011 that this was measured. I can't imagine that it's slowed down since then, and is probably increased with the number of projects. I know some major projects have been approved in very sensitive habitat north of Los Angeles. And if that happens, that's gonna take a huge swipe. So of the 11 Western states studied, California has lost 784 square miles of natural landscape to the human footprint in that decade. That's an area just smaller than Los Angeles and San Diego, which is, most of you are probably aware of how large that area is, and it's just mind-boggling. This destruction is such that it is going to be very, very difficult to get it back. And our natural capital, our animal life, our biota depends on this habitat. Prior to European settlement, the floristic province covered over 113,000 square miles, probably nearly the entire state. It covered the entire state. Now we're down to 25% of that, with just over 28,000 square miles. And this has been due to due to agriculture and development and pollution that comes with agriculture and development. California is the most hydrologically altered landmass on the planet. So much of the various habitats have disappeared. Wetlands, 50%. Riparian there's less than 1% left intact. Most of the Sacramento Valley was riparian woodland and freshwater marshes prior to European settlement. The vernal pools have, again, less than or more than 50% have been destroyed. And of our native grasslands, very few remain. There are more bird species in California than anywhere else in the United States. We have more than 500 recorded species, and 10 which are endemic or native to our state. 190 plus species of native mammals, and nearly 70 species of reptiles that are endemic as well. So you can see how really diverse compared to anywhere else in the United States, let alone the rest of the world, California is. And along with habitat loss worldwide, but here in California as well, where we can have some impact, we're seeing an insect apocalypse. Dr. Shapiro, who's a professor at UC Davis, has noted that pesticides loss of habitat, diseases, climate change, and human encroachment and more are some of the reasons why our global population of insects is dwindling. And I'm going to be explaining why that is so critical. So you can see how the populations are being impacted. And it's only when they find, go to nature reserves, do they find a little less impact, but that's because those nature reserves aren't being impacted to the degree that urban areas are with development. And why should we care? Well, insects create the biological foundation for all terrestrial ecosystems. This is because they cycle, they pollinate plants, they're seed disperser, fertility, and sources for the birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. All of those insectivores absolutely rely on insects as a food source. So this ecological Armageddon, it is possible to reverse it, but we've got to do some work. We've got to go beyond the idea that nature should be saved. We're only where nature remains, because pretty much a lot of people think that what's, our natural preserves, our national parks, etc., those are our nature areas, and pretty much have given up on the idea that we would have nature in our subdivisions and cities and the rest of it. But we need to bring those back in those areas, in the places where we work, live, play, and farm, and learn to coexist with nature. Without these individual efforts, it's going to be difficult to not have our whole system fall apart. So giving up isn't an option. The model of destroying the biosphere to expand our human footprint is absolutely unsustainable. We can't keep going like this, because as we know, it's not only this issue, which is harder for people to see on a day-to-day basis, but we're watching the impacts on climate change on a fairly regular basis now. And that's just a much bigger part of this picture. The public preserves are not big enough any longer to sustain biodiversity. Our national parks, state parks, preserves, etc., they're just far too fragmented themselves. And the legislation in the form of the Endangered Species Act, although it's been a good thing to help put the brakes on the impacts of development, it has not been sufficient to slow it down. We really need to abandon our old notions that nature's somewhere else and embrace nature and bring it back into our personal spaces. So we need a new conservation model, one that sustains the living systems on which we depend. Keep trying to hit the enter button. So in this new model, we need to look we know that the old assumptions are that pretty much that once people move to the suburbs or to the cities, the whole attitude has been just not even caring really about the natural resources in and around where you live. So, and leaving conservation to the conservationists and the scientists. And yet that's obviously not working. We all depend on the quality of the ecosystem for our continued existence, and so does all the flora and fauna as well. So if we can all step up and act as stewards in terms of enhancing the conservation of resources around us. So as I mentioned, little habitat remains undisturbed. And what does remain is exceptionally fragmented. I think it's easy enough for us all to see anywhere we go outside of, you know, if you're lucky enough to live in an area like I do in Cool, it's really not quite as obvious because I live in Oak Woodland. But if you move down to Sacramento, Roseville, the more developed slightly cities, the closer you get to the cities, you really see the fragmentation. And what happens with that fragmentation is larger populations get broken up and isolated from one another. So it makes it much more difficult for them to reproduce and exist as populations. And so they're much more vulnerable to extinction with any kind of major impacts. And species that do require larger home ranges are the ones who'll disappear first from those smaller patches that are left. And the fragments, as we continue to fragment and break up, those areas are losing species quicker. So every time a new subdivision is approved next to another subdivision, and we see that just, and I'm not trying to pick on Folsom, I just go to that area to can see on a daily basis. I remember down the Highway 50 corridor, you can see it now, and it used to be you saw the golden rolling hills of California to both sides of the freeway. And it looks like hopefully I'm not getting, looks like my internet's maybe, but anyway, so we used to still see that habitat. It's still clear in my mind what that used to be, and now it's a massive sea of homes. And so I think you can see with that fragmentation, there's very little wildlife and especially very little native plants left in that environment. So our parks and preserves are not enough to do this job alone of preserving habitat for species. So because it's not, one of the things we really need to look at is to bring restoration back and onto private property, to farms and ranches across the country. A lot of farmers are getting much more involved in this and creating hedgerows and habitat on their farms because they find it benefits them. So that's a good thing. And small city lots and getting corporations to change the way they landscape. I know now that parks are talking about taking out so much of the turf and actually planting native plants. So that's another step that helps get us closer to a goal of restoring habitat. But where we, as a population, and those of us here tonight, where we can make an impact is at our homes. We can provide we can help provide connections between isolated natural areas by doing restoration on our own properties in terms of providing native plants that will attract the insects and the other wildlife that follows them to help provide the connections that they need. This reduces their vulnerability to extinction and the pressures on their populations due to environmental fluctuations that do naturally occur, and that it will be occurring even more with climate change. Restoring the habitat helps create these effective biological corridors. The single most effective thing we can do in our ecosystem. It'll help reverse a loss of species. It helps provide stronger, more stable, productive systems. And it does help return species not seen for a long time. I was just involved on an online biodiversity conference today this is taking place in Los Angeles, but because there's a huge effort going on there, what they're seeing is return of bird species that haven't been seen for 30 years. And so it's making a difference. But it'll require the addition of millions of plants to our neighborhoods and corporate landscapes, to all of our spaces within our footprint, to help bring those back. And as Alice was saying, we sold a lot of plants at this last plant sale, and we hope to be able to continue doing that and getting them out into people's yards. So several things point us towards this new approach. Okay, I mentioned before, parks and preserves are too small and they're too separated from one another to be the end-all be-all in the remainder of what our natural systems are. We can't ignore the ecological value of land that is on private property. Restoring habitat actually helps create those biological corridors that connect the larger spaces through and help provide that additional habitat and expands the habitat, or it restores. I like to say that because it's like, it's too bad that it was ever taken away. So we're not really expanding it, we're restoring it, but it will help with the species to maintain populations and hopefully help them actually start to rebound. And again, by doing this, by restoring these corridors, it'll help them weather normal population fluctuations. So this was a quote I came across as I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. We need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. We need to restore honor to the way we live, so that when we walk through the world, we don't have to avert our eyes with shame, so that we hold our heads up high and receive the respectful acknowledgement of the rest of Earth's beings. This just really resonated with me as I was preparing this presentation over the last 2 months and getting my thoughts together. It was just like, yeah, for sure. So as we're looking and presenting this concept of habitat, homegrown habitat, I was very encouraged to kind of go out and do some research in terms of, well, what is going on? And one of the things that's occurring is there's this initiative that's called the California Essential Habitat Connectivity Project. And even though it's being run by the state, it's a strategy for conserving a connected California. And all of these various departments, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, are involved in this. So they're looking at a lot of projects that are on state and federal lands, but these don't affect private property per se, although it may improve areas around where we live if we're abutting up to Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management, etc. It's nice to know that these other initiatives are happening as well on another scale. The city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, they also have a huge biodiversity project ongoing that involves many of the cities and departments and everything else to try to start enhancing habitat in that environment, which is probably one of the most degraded in all of the state. So homegrown habitat does the same thing. That's what we're looking to do, is to provide that connectivity to expand habitat area for wildlife. And it provides us with the opportunity to interact on a personal level with nature and the ability to enjoy it all the time. I know I do on my property. It is something that, you know, even in the rainy times, even during the hottest times of the year, I think most of us who are here enjoy nature and like being out in it. So there are various types of wildlife corridors, and at the state and federal levels, we're looking at these big crossings. And then down to the more local level, we're looking at connective habitat in terms of local byways, parks, etc. And then the stepping stone approach would probably apply more to the homegrown habitat level of connectivity. unless you can get all your neighbors to buy it. That would be a nice thing, but as we individually take a role in restoring habitat on our own properties and providing habitat in the form of vegetation and other things that we can do, that provides a stepping stone. And as those grow together, then it starts to provide more cohesive connective habitat. So where we're going to find the space to do this? I know many of us probably already have somewhat developed landscapes, and wonder, you know, are you going to take out what you've got, or how are we going to make this work? And of all of the elements of constructed landscapes, the lawn is the worst at delivering essential ecosystems services. So it's the place that I'm going to suggest we look first. They're a great place to start building the biological corridors to start replacing. Turf is a monolithic crop that does not generally support wildlife. Natural grasses do, but turf does not. And yet it's the default plant in the landscape. I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of going down to Sacramento when they do their, or they used to do, and it won't be this year, but the or the garden tours. And it's a wonderful thing to do, and it's very encouraging, but one of the things I found so discouraging was all the homes in between, those who've done the work, that are still wall-to-wall lawns. There's a lot of room for improvement. Turf and non-native plants are the most dominant landscapes throughout California. NASA finds that there's over 60,000 square miles of lawn across America. Another study on turf grass nearly of the US. We expect to find, I think that's to be expected, and those probably won't go away any too quickly. But it's pretty much the #1 crop, larger than any other combined crop in agriculture. And the average California household irrigates roughly 200 to 3,600 square feet per home of turf. And that's a lot. So that's a lot of area that could be utilized for habitat. Any of you have a lawn know that they're not the least expensive. And especially when we talk about not just in dollar cents, but the overall ecological cost. The maintenance practices, mowing, watering, fertilizer, and pesticide use have a tremendous cost in terms of their impacts. So we're pretty much all aware and familiar with the terms these days of carbon sequestration, which is also coined as carbon sink or carbon sources. A carbon source is a system that produces more carbon than it stores, and that would be a forest, a woodland, a marsh, anything in its natural state. A lawn is actually a carbon, it is not a sequester, it is the absolute opposite of that. And for the benefit of the environment, we need more sinks, more sequestration, and less sources of carbon pollution. Let's see. I'm trying to get it to, there we go. Yes. So when you compare lawns to native plants, lawns filtrate and clean far less water than original plant communities do. They sequester far less atmospheric carbon. What's interesting, if you go online and you try to research this stuff, how the turf industry is trying to convince us all that, that turf is a really good thing and helps sequester carbon. But not when you look at all the factors involved in it. If you just took lawn and let it sit, that would be the truth. But if you're using it and maintaining it, like 99% of the people do, it is a carbon emitter, not a sequester. Maintaining turf grass produces carbon dioxide, running the mower, watering lawn. All of these activities involved with turf grass emit carbon. It does not sequester it. And in addition to one of the reasons that so many people got started with working with natives and starting to use natives in their homes was because of our whole issue with drought in this state. And one of the facts is just that out of 70% of the water that comes through our meters at home, if you're on a meter, 70% is used for traditional landscaping. It's used outside the walls of our house. Of that, if you have lawn, 70% of that water used outside is usually used for just irrigating your turf. Lawns definitely in this state require more water than is supplied by rainfall, and that is just not sustainable. It's always in the negative. In addition, the suburban lawns use 10 times more chemical pesticides and herbicides than an acre of farmland in general. And those pesticides and fertilizers contaminate runoff and groundwater, whether they're streams or whether they're the aquifers. 60 to 80% of fertilizer that's applied anyway gets washed down into the soil. It does not get taken up by plants, so it's pretty useless, but it does harm everything downstream of where you're applying it. In addition, the one thing that people don't consider very often is they pay for their pesticide services and their lawn care services is that pets and children are the most susceptible to these chemicals that are being applied and often have more incidence of cancer in the form of especially lymphoma. So it's one of the things, and you know, most of us, you think you want your dogs to have a lawn, that's fine if you're not putting chemicals on it, but it's not something you really love. That your pets, you don't want them being exposed to that either. So the solution for lawns is pretty simple. Either eliminate them altogether or don't make it any bigger than you really, really need it. Have just enough to let kids and dogs play a bit, if that's where they play. You know what, I found that my dogs rarely used a lawn even when I had one. And there are other species, other alternatives to lawns that are a lot more ecologically sound in terms of a choice, because they do attract pollinators. They don't require as much watering. They don't require as much mowing. So if you're going to want still some kind of lawn, at least look to a native species of grass that grows deeper roots, doesn't require the kind of fertilizers and etc. that we talked about earlier. And if you're going to have a lawn, mow it higher, mow it with an electric or mulching mower or a reel mower, and do not use pesticides and herbicides on it. That'll help reduce your overall footprint and benefit wildlife. So a lot of people consider, what, if no lawn, that's heresy. Many HOAs even require that you have lawn. Now, because of the laws that have been enacted in this state over the last 10 years, I believe now I don't believe HOAs can require lawn. And if anything, fortunately, cities are required to adhere to new standards for water use, in which you are limited to just pretty much a postage stamp size. But that doesn't mean there aren't lots of lawns that came way before these laws that could be retrofitted to something like you see on the screen here. That's a nice example of a native habitat in a city lot. I don't know about the rest of you, but I often, if I could ever come back to some place in time, it would be to pre-European settlement California. And I would just love to see what this state was like before development. All the different habitats, which were rich, productive ecosystems that supported all kinds of wildlife. And there's a whole list of them here. And where we live here in the foothills, we have grasslands, oak savannas, chaparral, some riparian woodland along the river corridors. We do have oak and mixed woodlands, our conifer forests. We have meadows, higher meadows up further. The marshes would be more down in Sacramento, and very few wetlands at this elevation, but you still can find little remnants of them. We're lucky to live in this environment. So oftentimes people wonder what makes a plant a native, you know, especially when you hear other terms like adapted and you know, they've been here a long time and because settlers brought them. So native plants are those that co-evolved with fungi, microorganisms, and animals. It's the foundation of the biological diversity. These guys all grew together, evolved together, and that's why they do the best job of providing food and shelter for the native animals. It's like, you know, one's doing a change, another one's adapting to it, and here you go, and you've got these relationships that introduced plants just can't meet those needs. So green by itself is not good enough. Any plant is not going to do the job. Plants, and especially native plants, determine the carrying capacity for wildlife because of this relationship that they have. Introduced plants don't support native animals through their life cycle. Not the way natives do. They might do in a pinch when that's all there is. It's sort of like deer. You know, they'll eat anything in a pinch. But introduced plants have the effect of decreasing and decimating local species diversity, especially when they become invasive. Native plants are far better at performing ecological roles and providing for the needs of the animals who have evolved with them. And think of it as like microbiomes. Microbiomes exist within every niche of ecology, of natural systems. Whether it's our guts or relationship. So our native plant food web, you know, we all know that plants transform sun energy into carbohydrates and sugars. And then these are stored in the roots or fed on by animals. And then what happens then that we're not necessarily so aware of is that insects convert a lot of these sugars and carbohydrates into the proteins and fats that other animals need and that they consume. And because of this coevolution that has occurred, insects are actually pretty fussy about what they eat. They've adapted to eat particular types of plants or a particular plant. And these special relationships, a lot of plants are unpalatable to almost all other insects except for this one species that has evolved to be able to eat it. But there's enough of it that it doesn't really impact the population that greatly, and so they both coexist. And really, as opposed to a food chain, we should be looking at as a food web. 90% of insect herbivores are diet specialists. So the host plant specialists are restricted, like I mentioned, to eating one or a few plants. And in particular, we can look at the monarch butterfly as an example of that. They are specialists on milkweeds. And there are many, many more insects like them out there. it's allowed for them to all adapt and to have a specialization and to keep going on. But this specialization doesn't happen overnight. It takes eons, and it's a long evolutionary process, and one that introduced plants in the place of native plants is interfering with. This homogeneous palette of introduced ornamentals has really resulted in a decline of insects that depend on native species. And as go the insects, with this insect apocalypse, we're seeing major declines in populations of birds and amphibians in particular. Introduced plants don't do a good job at any of these things. They don't support specialist pollinators. They don't stable food webs. They interfere with biodiversity, and they don't support ecosystem functions. So they are not ecological equivalents. They do not do the job that natives do. One of the many consequences of reduction in native plants, huge. These are the two primary impacts, is the reduction in caterpillar biomass. Birds rely on caterpillars, whether or not they are seed eaters as adults. All birds feed, as long as they're not shorebirds, not, you know, if you're talking birds that are on the coast or ocean-going birds, land species here feed their nestlings caterpillars. That's the primary source of food. And I know how many people, when you think about everybody in the spring, is usually freaking out about the numbers of caterpillars coming out of your oak trees and everywhere else. And I hope that the one thing you can walk away from this talk is to actually celebrate the caterpillars in the spring, because they are a food source for the birds. And then our native pollinators, that is the one thing that everybody seems to be on board with, is the need to protect our native pollinators. Heck, we know that they pollinate roughly 90% of all plants and are a huge source in terms of pollination for the foods we eat. Very important. And besides the bees, we know, oftentimes people are just not aware, they just don't think about it, but bees are not the only pollinators. We have hummingbirds, bats, our butterflies and moths, as well as beetles, are also in the considered pollinators. They provide those ecosystem benefits. This was another interesting part. So Doug Tallamy's book, if you've not read Nature's Best Hope, please, you really need to. His books are fabulous. They're much East Coast-centric, and the population information is universal. So introduced plants, in essence, are the equivalent of throwing a monkey wrench into the system. You know, a machine is going along, it's been built a particular way. If you start throwing other parts in, it's not going to continue to function properly. It keeps that engine from running the way it was intended to run. So that's what introduced plants are doing here. So when birds have less food sources, they lay fewer eggs, fewer chicks actually survive to adulthood, and they take longer to mature if they do survive. In California, the bird populations have taken a huge hit due to the loss of insect populations, due to the impact or the reduction in native plants. And this is based on a study where they combined the data the National Audubon's Christmas bird counts and summertime surveys from the U.S. Geological Survey. And they've all attributed these population losses to habitat loss. So if we take on the job of restoring insects, we can help restore this loss. We can reverse this loss. The habitat required for nesting sites for pollinators has been diminished hugely by development. When you consider how a home site is built, you are just taking out huge areas of habitat. 70% of native bees actually nest underground. Our native bees, for the most part, are not colonizers. Even the ones that nest in cavities pretty much are individual. And the other insects that we are depleting are our predators and parasitoids, otherwise known as beneficial insects. These predators and parasitoids actually help keep pests under control. So as we restore habitat, we also restore these other insects that help keep things in balance and everything else pollinated. Insects also decompose dead plants and release nutrients. They help sequester in themselves, in their own bodies, but plus by the decomposition, they help sequester enormous amounts of carbon. And really, most insects are harmless and beneficial at that. And it's still one of those things where I find it amusing when people get so freaked out by spiders. I don't like seeing them in my house, and I'll try to take them out if I possibly can, but there's just things around. I think it's really interesting to watch more children. If they haven't learned it from an adult, I think children tend to be fascinated with insects until someone teaches them otherwise. So besides the insects, a lot of native adult birds, besides eating insects and seeds, also eat berries. So what is the difference here? That was one of the things that I thought, And I looked this up, and one of the things is that native berries often contain nearly 50% by weight fat and proteins that birds need. So there's a significant difference between the fat content and birds in particular. You think about when berries ripen, they ripen usually later in the season, summer on through fall, when they're getting ready to migrate or do other things, and don't have much food for the winter time. So those berries are a very important source. So it's important to have a source of native grown berries for them. And a Wendell Berry quote that here, there is in fact no distinction between the fate of the land and the fate of the people. When one is abused, the other suffers. And I think that with what we're seeing with habitat being diminished so greatly in our state, it's impacting wildlife tremendously. So building our own homegrown habitat. Now we get down to the nitty-gritty of what can you do? What can we do, all as individuals? So number one, consider you have a lawn, but reduce it. It was never meant to be wall-to-wall carpeting. So think of it in those terms, because every square foot dedicated to lawn is a square foot degrading local ecosystems. And then, of course, removing invasive species. Invasive species are introduced species that just grow at an exceptionally fast rate and really take over areas, and difficult to get a handle on if it gets out of control. So just removing anything that has that tendency to begin with, because it's too difficult to kind of keep up with it. Planting keystone species is really key because they are the powerhouse. And I'll be coming up with a list of a few plants here really soon. But Keystone species are the backbone, that because they provide the greatest bang for the buck in terms of per plant. It's like oak trees. Oak trees feed something, hundreds of species of insects and birds, etc. And be generous with your plantings. You know, the more natives that you can incorporate into your yard will enhance the diversity of other animals that, and when I say animals, that animals includes insects. It includes everything that's not plants. So the more you have, the more diversity and the more diversity you'll be attracting. And make sure that it's not just one layer, it's not just ground cover, it's layering in terms of understory trees, shade trees, ground cover, large shrubs, medium shrubs, etc. The more diversity you have that way, you know, different animals and especially birds use different habitat differently. And planting, the thing is diversity. Whether you're planting specifically to try to attract and increase the health of pollinators, diversity is the one thing that, by not planting one thing and planting many, many different types of plants, you will attract the greatest numbers of other animals and keep that biodiversity there, or actually enhance it. You might consider, if you've got the type of neighbors, I'm very lucky. I've got a neighbor who they're planting natives as well. There's a big benefit to that in that our habitats run together and increase larger area. So if you've got like-minded neighbors, that's just a big bonus in terms of growing homegrown habitat and creating connectivity and growing those corridors. One of the things that, as beside your native plants, because all animals need water, is install a small water feature. Whether it's, as on the left, just a small bubbling little water feature, and the one on the far right is the waterfall at my home. I have a small pond with this waterfall, and every day there has to be at least a dozen species I can watch at any particular day coming to visit that, from hummingbirds to warblers and goldfinches, robins, towhees, just a whole plethora of birds coming and using and bathing and drinking out of the waterfall in particular. And here in the center, you can see it looks like a scrub jay possibly bathing in it. They really enjoy that. Bee hotels are one of the ways to help with pollinators, but one of the things you really need to consider is do not do the thing on the right there. These giant bee hotels are an attractive, when you put that many individuals together, you're asking for, number one, major problems with disease or them just not using it at all. You'll probably get a few species to move into it, but that's not an efficient use of that type of material. What you want to look at is the smaller the better in terms, and then spread a number of them out throughout your yard to provide habitat for them to live in. Create caterpillar pupation sites under your trees by simply leaving your leaves there. Again, caterpillars are the main caterpillars that develop on a plant, actually drop to the ground to pupate or go underground. Lawn is not a good place for that because it gets compacted, plus people are generally applying pesticides and herbicides to that, and so that's not going to benefit anything that's underneath. So keystone species that you should be looking at, if you don't already have them around you or in your garden, you're wanting to add, say, trees. Oaks, as I mentioned before, you get absolutely the biggest bang for the buck because they are a keystone species. These are the 5 native species I have growing on my property and grow all over this county. Our interior live oaks, black oaks, blue oaks, valley oaks, and there's other species as well. Native wild cherries. The bitter cherry and choke cherries are endemic to, they're native to this area and easy to get a hold of in general. We sold I think we sold both of these at our plant sale. They'll get quite large, 20 to 30 feet tall, but they provide a nice screen. Obviously, these flowers are a huge attractor to pollinators, and the berries the birds love too. I've planted a number of these in my yard this year as I planted my orchards in hopes that it will take the pressure off of my fruit trees when the fruit ripens. Willows are another keystone species. They require a little more water, so if you have a natural creek or a bog area, rain garden, this would be the appropriate plant to plant there. Willows are known to be insectaries as for beneficial insects in particular. Great plant. Our herbaceous species include lupin, sagewort, coyote bush, and senecio, goldenrod. These grow well all throughout our area and again provide a big bang for the buck. I just saw a baccharis in bloom out at the Wakamatsu, and that was covered in all kinds of pollinators. So it's a big attractant. One of the things I noticed is key, it was funny looking at getting photographs for these plants, is that there seems to be a theme of yellow flowers. The goldenrod, or excuse me, goldenrod was not on the last page. Solidago, rabbit brush, deer vetch. I've got deer vetch coming up as I've been landscaping my own yard. Deer vetch is coming up naturally. If you're going to be landscaping, one of the things I think you want to do is keep an eye on what is coming up as you start to landscape, and get your plant ID books out or your apps on your phone and see what it is before you go pulling it. I have found, I've been delighted at the numbers of native species that are popping up. It's really fun. And then you've got the wild strawberry as well. So one of the places that you can find great lists for your specific area for keystone species is the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder website. It is good, but what I'm going to show you now is CalScape's site, because this is affiliated with CalFlora, and which is the repository for all native plants pretty much in California. If you want to know what something is and you want to log it in, you go to CalFlora, and if you want to landscape, I suggest you go to the sister site, CalScape. So this is a screenshot of the main homepage. So you take a look, and up in the right-hand corner, there's an advanced search text right there. Click on it, and it will take you to the next page to do an advanced search, in which case you can see here that there are all kinds of criteria by which you can check those off to determine, to find a type of plant that you want to. So in this case, I plugged in the town where I live, cool. I clicked on shrubs for full sun, medium drainage. My drainage is really good. And if you have extremely low water, you want it to require almost, once it's established, air, you want it to attract bees. And then once you this is what it came up with. There's not a lot that, with this particular search, it came up with these two particular species, which are great. I've got, and I have got the hollyleaf redberry that I bought at the plant sale this year. I'm sure that'll be a great addition. So that's nice to know. So then I went back and I changed the criteria to part shade, still medium drainage because that's what I've got, but moderate to high water. Now, if you're like many people and you have an existing yard and you have existing irrigation and you want to start maybe replacing some of your plants, but you don't want to change your whole irrigation system or the way you water, then you need to look at plants that are going to fit in with what you already do have. So in that case, when I plugged those parameters in, there were 28 plants that popped up on the search results here. And you can see there's just all kinds of diversity there. So then I clicked on one, the creek dogwood, just as an example to show you. And when you click on that plant to see more about it, it'll show you photographs of the plant, and then it'll show you where it grows naturally. So you can see from that that this plant is definitely endemic to our area. It grows well. It's native there, and so chances are you'll be able to do well with it. As you move down the page, you can see that it tells you a lot more about the plant in terms of its height, its habit, the characteristics of the leaves, the fruits, the flowers. Gives you those in two different, it gives you the verbal and then it gives you the icons. And then it also tells you what wildlife it supports, which is really totally cool. I think I need to go back. But in particular, if we're looking for stuff that attracts caterpillars, well, look at all the butterflies and moths that this plant is host to. So that's a bonus. 13 confirmed species, 29 likely. Okay, then you drop even further down and it tells you about all the cultural requirements. What kind of sun, what kind of watering, other good companion plant species. That's really nice to know. And then it also tells you your sunset zones. Now, not every one of these will have all the sunset zones necessarily listed, so you might want to dig out your sunset garden book or go online to double check the zone for these plants. But if it shows up on this map as being in the range where you live, then you can be pretty well assured that it's going to do well in that zone. So that covers kind of going in, how you individually can go in and look for plants that suit what you want, your habitat, your conditions, how you want to maintain, etc. So in addition to getting the right plants, there are other activities too. So replacing your lawn under trees with native shrubs and ground covers. Include things like large decorative boulders if you have them available, or you like that look, or if you have them on site. And keeping logs and old tree stumps if you have them around and it fits in with what you're doing. I'm on 5 acres. I'm only landscaping 3/4 of an acre. The rest of my site, I try to leave these things. I even left up 25 or 30 feet of a pine tree in order to leave it as a place for an acorn storing place for the woodpeckers, a granary. And they're at it. It got hit by borers 2 years ago, had it cut off, and then leaving the rest. And it's fun to actually watch that thing decay and over time. This is something, another one of these initiatives that you're hearing lots and lots about. Leave the leaves, don't rake them up, don't burn them, leave them alone if you can. I rake mine, I rake them under my huge egg caterpillars. They're developed critters, small critters that rely on the leaf, you know, what's going on within those leaves. You look at the ringneck snake. Oh, the wood, the little frogs. I mean, oh, I've got those everywhere. Salamanders, fritillaries. I see these things all on my property, and it's like, so it's that much more encouragement to just, and I'm always posting these things every time I see somebody on Facebook asking how to get rid of their leaves, and, you know, it's like, oh no, leave those alone. The other thing is, we all pretty much know, those of you in the audience, I'll bet you know, do not spray pesticides, herbicides, and stop using fertilizers. Totally contrary to the principles of homegrown habitat. Most native plants are perfectly adapted to low nitrogen soils. That's one of the reasons they grow fairly slowly, but that's okay. They're nice and stable. They get what they need from the soil. Artificially fertilized soils actually encourage weakness in the plants, and it encourages deer to eat them. There's something, using fertilizer on your plants is essentially like putting icing on a cake and then leaving it out for children. It is just something about that makes it sweet and just something they can't even pass up. So you stop fertilizing, you'll see a decline in the browsing, most likely. And again, the whole thing with fertilizers in the first place, not being taken up and then going through the soil and into the water tables. And get this, we're almost done here. So soils rich in organic matter are sufficient for healthy plants. By leaving the leaves, that's the other thing, they just decay. The soil organisms take them in and work them, you know, they break down the matter and feed all the different organisms in the soil, keeping it. Leaves are great for your soil besides the wildlife. If you are using, if you have lights on all night at your property, put them on a motion sensor. Blazing security lights are ecological traps for moths, and it really has a huge impact on the population. If you have a lawnmower, set it high. Set it so you're mowing 3 or 4 inches high. You'll generally result in healthier and greener grass. I have pastures that need to be mowed for fire dangers, and I was so dismayed this spring to have run over a king snake. I was just, oh, or it was a giant gopher snake. But it was like, if I couldn't set mine any lower, but it's one of those, yeah. I think if anything else, what I'll do next year is go weed whack before I try to mow. But anyway, just know that that's one of the disadvantages of mowing. So, and just as we're doing here with CNPS, educating other people. If you live in an area that has an HOA that's restrictive about the use of things like getting rid of lawns, or even trying to use native species, educating these folks to help them change their antiquated ways, their antiquated restrictions and rules. That's something that we can do. I will say I'd be happy to come and do talks with various groups about these kinds of things, but going out where we see it with all of the various organizations, all the various chapters. People are doing this on a fairly regular basis now. And these organizations are changing. So in closing, I mentioned before Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. Our environmental boat has sprung a leak. Many of us are trying to repair the leak. Others are bailing to keep us afloat until the leak is plugged. What is baffling, though, is that far too many of us are dumping new buckets of water into our boat as if thinking it will not be a problem for them. At this point, each of us must decide what role we will play in the future. Will you be a bailer or a dumper? Your choice of plants in your yard will determine what role you have chosen. And thank you for listening. And so with that, I'd really like to I'm looking forward to let's leave now.
Thank you so much,
So-
Kit. That was really good. So I guess we're open now for questions. Did you have a chance to look at any in the chat, or if anybody
Okay, I'm here on the chat. Okay. All right. Even out in the rural, let's see. There's invasive weeds have changed things. Yep. I've had intermittent counter twice. Yes, of course. Okay, so yeah, our native wildlife includes all the larger mammals as well. If we convert to native garden instead of lawn, what tasks can we give our mow and blow gardeners to help with weekly? I was just having this conversation with someone today. It's the frustration of everything getting turned into balls and squares. What I call the landscape architect's nightmare. Anybody, and I see Marcia, you're here. Every designer's nightmare is having their all the plants in their design turn into something that they're not supposed to be. I would suggest for that part of it that you teach them or explain to them what natural pruning is, and that's using actual pruners and naturally pruning off at joints, not hedging around into a ball and clipping things. You just judiciously prune here and there. Have them rake your leaves under your trees. I have more than once had guys here that are helping with landscape projects think they were doing me an additional service by raking up my leaves, and I had them put them all back, much to their dismay. So you need to teach them as well, but yeah, you're not going to probably have much more for them to do if you're trying to keep them busy. So mulch, compost, plenty of that. Yes, and with native plants, you want to be a little bit careful on getting too rich a compost under some of these plants, especially the ones that like it really dry. I've noticed that where my Fremontodendron and my Madelia poppy are growing, it just likes neglect. It does. I'm not going to change a darn thing about what I've been doing out there because they're happy. It's the only place I don't have sort of mulched. But you don't want to go as heavy with mulch as you do with, unless they're water loving plants or like more moderate water. If they're low to really low, you need to be careful with the mulch. They don't need weekly upkeep. No, because they do grow slower. You're not applying fertilizers, and that keeps things going a little more slowly. Fire safe practices, yes, and coming up, I believe down the road here another month or in a couple of months, Alice is going to be doing her presentation on fire safe landscaping, because no matter what, you need to be very cognizant of where you're putting plants. Don't put any landscaping within 5 feet of structures. Keep your trees at least 30 feet away. And then don't get it exceptionally dense. We're talking about, yes, step it up a bit depending on what you've got, but you also don't want things so dense you can't walk through things. And Alice, actually, from the presentation I saw her do, has it been 3 months already, Alice? she's got some really great examples in there of what a good fire safe landscape should look like. And yeah, so have raked some of the trees for fire season. Okay, so the leaves, I know the one thing I see this come up is leaves and fire safe. So in the first place, most trees aren't usually dropping their leaves too much, other than buckeyes during the summer. But you do want to be careful of the buildup, and you want to keep them away from structures. You don't want them to get too deep, but as soon as it starts raining, like it's done, I noticed that, boy, my leaves just start settling right down and start decaying. So it pretty much, there's just a short window that you have to just be careful and make sure you keep them not piled up in areas where if embers flew into them, they would be a hazard. Okay, so what for fire safe plants? Okay, this is fire safe plants. There's really no such thing. Next week, there was a great definition. It has more to do with the characteristics of plants that you want to look at in terms of some are less prone to combusting, but all plants will burn in the right conditions. So it's more of your design than anything, but yes, being aware of some of the characteristics will help you make decisions about what to use. Sacramento Bee nature preschools, such as botanical gardens, very encouraging. Yes, yes, yes. I would agree. I think that, oh, and Ginny, you mentioned that. I hope something that we as a chapter can start perhaps working with some of the schools to create native gardens at schools, as opposed to some of the native vegetable gardens, which has been a big hit, but there's a whole constraint of what do they do with them during the summertime. Native gardens, they won't have to worry about them. So does how's it to get device? No, we don't as an organization. We do have, I believe, Alice, we have a list of consultants on our chapter site.
Yes, that's right. Actually, Annie is willing to come out to people's house and take a look and teach them about some of the native plants at their house. And so if that's something that you're interested in and you live in El Dorado County, this is Angela and Sandy, then let's see, give me your contact information. You can go to our website, eldoradocnps.org, and contact us and say that you'd like Annie to come out to your house, and I think she would be able to do that.
Okay, but we also have designers.
Oh, yes.
As you know, Marcia's here. Is Christy here this evening? Christy Johnson, myself, I'm a landscape architect. So there are a number of us who do, who provide design services, if that's what you're looking for as well. But we don't, we're not overt about pushing that.
Contact information for all of those is also available on our website. If you go to, actually, I'm not sure if you're on there yet, Kit, I hope so. But if you go to that same website, we have a number of designers listed there.
Okay. Let's see, Annie Walker, Kit, are you, oh, yes, I am related. Yes, my husband is of that, and I am just gotten involved with Wakamatsu as well. We're looking as a chapter to collaborate with the American River Conservancy in hopes of being able to do something perhaps with a little native nursery there at the Wakamatsu, as well as I'm going to give them some assistance, design assistance with their new tea garden. So that's something that is close to our hearts. Are there any other questions specifically about plants or how to create habitat or anything like that that I can answer for anybody? No? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kit. We really appreciate it. Let's give you a hand here. And thank you everyone for coming and listening. And I think we're all inspired to go out and add still more natives to our yard.